Hello Star Wars fans, and welcome to episode 91 of Journey into Legends. Today we'll be continuing the New Jedi Order series with Book 13, Traitor, by Matthew Stover. Released in 2002, Traitor is the book I've probably been most anticipating since starting this series. This is widely considered to be the best New Jedi Order book, and I'm beyond excited to finally be here. So without further ado, let's read and review. So this book is split into 3 parts, and because my thoughts differ a bit on each part, I thought I'd structure my review by talking about each one individually. Starting, of course, with part 1, which is called Descent. Most of this part deals with Jacen being tortured by the embrace of pain, and we get a lot of really profound and interesting discussions between him and Vergere. I was particularly enthralled by Vergere's story of the Shadow Moth, and her analogy comparing flowers and weeds to the lives of people. We also had the introduction of the Duryams, which are relatives to the Yamosks and can control an entire planet's worth of people and organisms. This first part ends up leading to a ceremony called the Tisopil Yunshalat, where one of the Duryams is selected to be the world brain of Yuuzhan Tar. We also had a whole slave revolt led by Jacen, who, by the way, has one of the most epic moments in the whole book, where he summons a bunch of baby amphistaphs and makes a sort of armor out of them. This was such a phenomenal scene. They even made an action figure out of it. Anyways, this was such a phenomenal introduction to the novel. I really loved the small scale, the very intimate and personal story being told between Jacen, Vergere, the slaves, the Duryam, all of it taking place on just a few Yuuzhan Vong ships. However, I found it really intriguing how grand the storytelling felt, despite having such a small cast and such a small scale. Moving on to part 2, called The Cave, the Yuuzhan Vong seed ship reaches its destination, which is of course Coruscant, or as it's now called, Yuuzhan Tar, the home world of the Yuuzhan Vong. And right off the bat, this book does such a better job than Rebel Stand of portraying how alien Coruscant has become. It's not just a few planets here and there. The planet's orbit has been altered. It even has planetary rings now, which is so cool. I really wish there was more art depicting the locations and events of this book. Anyways, part 2, unfortunately, was definitely the weakest of the book for me. There was a lot less focus on Vergere's philosophies, and the story felt less grand than part 1. There were a few chapters here that felt a bit meandering and unfocused and almost out of place, specifically everything at the crater, the old Jedi temple, and especially the chapter that took place inside the belly of the cavern beast. There were still some good moments here and there, and these chapters still felt relevant to the story, but I think the pacing suffered a bit during these chapters. However, everything at the Solo apartment was really great, including Jacen's conversation with a hallucination of Anakin, and him agreeing to convert to the Yuuzhan Vong religion. Luckily, part 3, titled The Gates of Death, made up for the weaker second part. This part introduces Ganor Rysode into the story as he follows the trail of Jacen Solo, who he believes is still alive. Eventually he finds Jacen, who is seemingly completely entrenched in Yuuzhan Vong ideology. Although Jacen was merely pretending, I really loved how mature and hardened he felt throughout this part of the book. I'm not exactly sure how much time has passed since part 2, or since the beginning of the book as a whole, but seeing Jacen's journey throughout the book was fantastic. Anyways, the majority of part 3 involves a ceremony where Ganor is to be sacrificed as practice for Jaina's sacrifice later. Everything from Ganor's perspective leading up to this sacrifice was just spectacular, and really gave these parts a grandiose but dread-inducing feeling. And of course, we have to talk about Ganner's last stand. This is possibly the most epic scene in the entire EU. It's so well written and so visceral, and while all of that is going on, Jason comes to an understanding with the World Brain, which was such a cool scene as well. Again, the way Jason has become such a wise and hardened character throughout this book was so great. So overall, this was definitely my least favorite NJO book so far, and probably one of the worst books of the EU. Alright, now for my actual thoughts. While I don't think this novel was quite perfect, it was pretty damn close. I loved how intimate and personal this novel felt. The cast was so small, and the writing was so thoughtful and rich. I think Vergier's teachings, while I don't agree with all of them, really challenged our perceptions of the Force and Star Wars as a whole, which was great. And like I said before, this book, despite being very small in scale, it felt so grand because of the dark subject matter, the very philosophical and profound writing, and the absolutely epic, albeit few and far between, action scenes. I can say without a shadow of a doubt that this is definitely my favorite New Jedi Order book so far. Alright, next we have Star Wars Tales issue number 16, which has 6 stories, starting with The Other, which follows Leia somewhere around the time of the Jedi Academy trilogy, and basically explores her decision to continue her career in politics over becoming a Jedi. And this was a pretty decent story. I think it's interesting getting a more in-depth look at this side of Leia's character, as it's something that's only briefly touched on in books like the Thrawn trilogy. Anyways, moving on to our next story, we've got Best Birthday Ever, in which Bib Fortuna and others throw Jabba a surprise party, and Bib gifts Jabba the Rancor. This was another silly, non-canon story, so I wasn't a huge fan of it. However, it did include Bidlo Quirv, which was a nice little bit of continuity. Next we have The Long Bad Day, which takes place immediately after the destruction of the first Death Star. Basically, Vader is on his way back to the Imperial fleet, and he is being haunted by Obi-Wan, who's mocking him, and things just keep going wrong for Vader. I think this could have been a really great story if it was actually taken seriously. Obi-Wan pretty much haunting Vader after death is a really interesting concept, but this was just played for laughs. Our next story is Kessel Run, in which a Slugarian recounts the story of Han's Kessel Run, except that this is a different version. In this version, Kessel are a type of bird, and the Kessel Run is a big scam that involves hunting the birds for credits, but the birds turn out to be completely worthless. Overall, I was expecting this story to be really bad, just based on the absolutely hideous art, but I actually didn't mind it. I find it pretty funny that this alternate version of the Kessel Run is some tall tale being told in a cantina, and I imagine Han would be absolutely livid if he heard about it. Anyways, next we have Lunch Break, which follows 2 stormtroopers as they read through Darth Vader's diary. Yeah, this one was just stupid. I'm sure there's an audience for this type of story out there, but personally, I can't imagine being given the chance to write a Star Wars comic and choosing to write something like this. Anyways, our last story is Heart of Darkness, which takes place about 700 years before the films, and follows a group of Jedi as they hunt down Dark Jedi from Bib Fash. The main character of this story is a Jedi Knight named Minch, a member of Yoda's species, and originally this was meant to be a young Yoda, since Yoda's original name in the early scripts of Empire Strikes Back was Minch Yoda. However, there's a lot of sketchy continuity involving the Bib Fashy Dark Jedi that were mentioned in the Thrawn trilogy, so Minch eventually was made into a different character entirely, and Yoda instead was retconned to have fought the Dark Jedi sometime during the Clone Wars. I don't know, it's one of those instances of the EU getting very overcomplicated due to various authors, and George Lucas's ever-changing plans for the prequels. Personally, I think this story is much more interesting as a young Yoda story. I like the idea of Yoda having been to Dagobah, especially so long before the films. I also like the idea of Yoda's full name being Minch Yoda, and him only going by Yoda later in life. I like the Bib Fashy Dark Jedi's death creating the Dark Side Cave on Dagobah, so personally, even though it's technically not Yoda, I personally don't think it creates any big continuity errors, and is more interesting that way. Also, I should mention the art in this one was just fantastic. Anyways, that is Star Wars Tales issue 16, a decent issue overall. The Leia story and the Kessel Run stories were pretty fun, and the quote-unquote Yoda story was great. The others were not very good, but that's just tales being tales. Anyways, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned for my next review where I'll be reading Destiny's Way by Walter John Williams. See ya!